They plan to take over the world. They plan to be a global maritime hegemony, following in Britain and America's footsteps with a much more authoritarian control mechanism. So this is an existential threat to democracy and freedom, and basically it's a live or die moment that we're in. There is no living with you. It's just a question of how long you live with you before you don't live.
In the second half of this interview, David Murrin says the Chinese Communist Party is the world's biggest threat.
And in this country, we've had a blindness to China that is just incredible. Driven by the Treasury's need to make money from someone and have investment, we tried to give our soul away.
David talks about Chinese weapons that are so advanced, Western forces cannot defend against them.
It's built a fortress economy, it's stockpiled, it's militarised its system, its ability to run itself, its espionage levels, its infiltration, its sabotage of West on every single level. You don't create those paradigms and then stop. You create them and then use them.
He says we need to wake up to the Chinese regime's plans to conquer our freedoms.
We will not survive the Chinese. I can see if we carry on like this, the Chinese will dominate the globe, and freedom of speech and democracy and the genes of lateralization that created the origins of democracy will all be removed from mankind's genes. And for English people who are pretty individualistic, that means an awful lot of us will be on the disappear list.
So World War III, I mean, how real or how close is it, and what are the kind of key markers that people should be looking out for and wary of?
So I argue and continue to argue that it started with the invasion of Ukraine.
Okay.
The scale of the war taking place in Ukraine is enormous. And I think it's easy for us to just think it's somewhere over there. It's not a proxy war, it's enormous. You know, the number of people being killed, injured, the resources required to fight that 600-mile front battle with the deep strike battle for both sides is huge. And so that itself would make me think we've started. And now you add in the existential threat of Iran and Iran over Israel.
Yeah.
And we have to be very clear what we are seeing in the Middle East. We're seeing an Iran that was founded on the destruction of Israel. And its casus belli is to destroy Israel and bond the Sunnis so it can become the predominant power in the Middle East. That was how the Islamic regime framed its architecture. So it created proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Axis of Resistance, and it surrounded Israel with the sword of Damocles, and the war started on the 7th of October. I suspect it was triggered by the Iranians who were fearful of the Abraham Accords bonding Israel to Saudi Arabia. They couldn't afford to see that. And they created this heinous act, and we tend to call them terrorists, but I don't think Hamas is a terrorist organization. I think it's a state. It was given the freedom to run the strip, and it used all the money the West gave that was meant to be for the education and furtherment of its population. It dug tunnels and prepared to go to war. And sadly, when it did enact that terrible, heinous crime on the 7th of October, most of the people were in the street celebrating. So you must keep in touch that it is a state-on-state war, not a group of terrorists embedded in a population that would reject them. And although Israel itself is far from blameless on the West Bank, and it has extremists in its Zionist causes which are difficult to sympathise with on any level. So you're not looking at anyone having whiter than white. The Israelis were attacked, and they have a right to basically remove that threat. And they've done that systematically by initially defanging Hamas, and then they defanged Hezbollah, and then they had to go to Iran that was making a nuclear breakout. And now they're back trying to deal with the remnants of Hamas, which rejuvenated with less experience. And at the backdrop, we've also got the Iranians still making a nuclear breakout because they've got at least 2 facilities we didn't know about, deeper than can be bombed, where they are obviously doing enrichment.
Right.
So that was just a delay, and it was actually a failure because I think the Iranians really outthought us. I've long since argued that on September the 8th, I asked the question, how did Hamas pull the wool over Mossad's eyes? And some people who are conspiracy say, well, they knew and they let them in because they needed the war. I'm not convinced about that. Why would you have a war when you could have the Abraham Accords? That doesn't make sense to me. You'd have the Accords and then do the war. You wouldn't do it at that time. So Hamas were taught, probably by the IRGC, the Republican Guard, how to circumvent Mossad penetration techniques. And where did they learn that? In their nuclear program. And if they did that for Hamas, they probably had a second nuclear program hidden under the one we saw destroyed in the war. And that is what is continuing. and they're building missiles, and more of them wherever possible. Their fattier ones penetrated the air defences, and the most concentrated missile defences were penetrated by it, which means they don't have to build many nuclear weapons with the help of Russia's militarisation. It's a proper nightmare. So that's a major conflict zone. We've got two now. And to have two, coincidentally, I think classifies as a world war when you look at the fact it's been orchestrated by this hub that is China, that I argue has been preparing for war since the onset of the pandemic. It's built a fortress economy, it's stockpiled, it's militarized its system, its ability to run itself, its espionage levels, its infiltration, its sabotage of West on every single level. You don't create those paradigms and then stop. You create them and then use them. And no arms race in history has not resulted in the weapons being used. And they are in and have been promoting the biggest arms race over the past 4 years we've seen since First and Second World Wars. So we are really, in it. And it's just they're choosing their moment to act.
How dangerous do you think that the Chinese Communist Party is?
Unbelievably dangerous. It's unbelievably dangerous because it rules 1.2 billion Chinese who are incredibly, their cultural heritage is sophisticated and intelligent. They are remarkable people who go back a long time, and yet the social engineering has completely constrained their sense of freedoms. And the algorithms that go between assessing behaviours and what you do and don't do has meant that the Communist Party has total control of its population. And they see individuality as a virus. Look what they did to the Uyghurs, a hostile Muslim society, crushed, tortured, sterilised. No one seemed to make a lot of noise about that. And if you could do it to a hostile subset of your society, you could do it to anyone. Look at Hong Kong. 6 generations of capitalist endeavour and democracy wiped out in months because they knew who to take out. And if you take the leadership groups out, everyone else becomes like straw in the wind or grass in the wind, just waving backwards and forwards. So they see the West as a source of individual viruses. And I'm absolutely convinced that their planning does not just extend to Taiwan, but extends to the whole of the third island chain, down to Australia and New Zealand, to eject America from that region, to ultimately subjugate Japan and South Korea, which for the West is a disaster because what's left of industrialization isn't in Chinese hands, is in Japanese and South Korean hands. We need them to build ships for us, for example, if we're to match shipbuilding in China. And we're just beginning, like Australia, to work out what a great asset their shipyards are. But the Chinese will refuse access to them if they gain the third island chain. Because then what will they do? They'll build thousands of warships, and then when they're ready, they'll come out with fleets that are unimaginably huge and control the oceans. And one by one, they'll do what the Western world did, surround the continents and each trade route and squeeze the country until it succumbed. So they plan to take over the world. They plan to be a global maritime hegemony, following in Britain and America's footsteps, with a much more authoritarian control mechanism. So this is an existential threat to democracy and freedom. And basically, it's a live or die moment that we're in. There is no living with you. It's just a question of how long you live with you before you don't live. Those are our choices, or resist.
It seems naval power is quite key to all of this. Can you talk to us a bit about that and what's happening in the South China Sea?
Well, naval power is something which is one of my little bugbears. Is Britain was obviously a maritime empire. And one of the arguments that I make is that the ratio of coastline to internal volume dictates how many lateral people versus linear people you have, because seafarers tend to be lateral. Right. The environment is multivariable, it's challenging, and lateral thought processes, intuitive processes, get to infer survivability. So it was no coincidence that in Holland and Britain, or going back to Athens, which was a sea power, that actually democracy came out of sea, self-responsibility, lateralization, and the sense of needing to have responsibility, which created meritocracy and democracy. So democracy is linked to the sea, and Britain and America are both democratic systems. It's interesting that China isn't. And the reason why it can contemplate being a global maritime hegemony is because communications allows you to control the individuals on ships who are less individual. In the previous early years of sail, you had a whole lateral ships that went away for 5 years without commands from the outside. Yeah. They had to follow their missions, survive and adapt, and be resilient enough to come back, which is why maritime lateralization was really like a USP about the people as well as the technology. So what China wishes to do is to essentially become what America was and what Britain once was, control of the seven seas. So how has it started to do that? Well, its first step was actually to negate American power. So American power from the Second World War was twofold. Its submarines and most importantly its carriers. And its carriers were designed to come up to your coast somewhere around 600 to 550 miles and cycle its aeroplanes in bombing missions at 180 missions a day and bomb the crap out of anyone who resisted. And that's been American power. So the Chinese quite rightly worked out what happens if we just hold them back and we push them further out than they can launch their planes to attack us, as in deny them access to an area. So access area denial is a whole strategy of you create missile systems that push the carriers further back. And the first time we knew they were really coming online was in 2018 when DF-26s, which were intermediate range ballistic missiles, were then optimized to kill carriers with warheads that could delineate and see a carrier from above. And the mathematics then, which I wrote about, was 50 of these missiles would overcome a carrier and 3 destroyer escorts because their defense system would be saturated. So once the Chinese worked that out, they were beginning to challenge the Americans. And I remember talking to American admirals at the time, and they were really hubristic, just as battleship captains were, about air power. It was one of those very similar moments. And then since then, of course, the Chinese have only built more of those systems. They've now added hypersonic glide weapons, which are pretty much unstoppable once the hypersonic glide vehicle has left the bus in the upper atmosphere and starts to skip along. We don't really have the technology to stop it, which means they're almost definite kills. Right. And we don't even have the technology to study ourselves and how best to counter it because we don't have those weapons. And there may be problems like how they're controlled, but we don't have enough and we don't know enough about them. And we certainly have implemented counters. So the US Navy can't operate carriers inside the second island chain. And it was only a few weeks ago with an exercise with the South Koreans, the Japanese and the Australians, I think it was the Philippines. For the first time ever, they didn't have a carrier. And I think, Hegseth was on record as saying, we'll lose our carriers in the first 24 hours. Right. So the Americans are quite rightly thinking about keeping their carriers intact somewhere else until defensive technology like lasers catches up. And that makes it very hard to defend this whole region.
So you're saying they can't defend those carriers?
Yes, I am.
Really?
So America is no longer the global hegemony. It can't brandish a big stick any longer in that region. And it's just a matter of when China chooses to basically create that envelope and create a preemptive strike, very similar to Pearl Harbor. It's set up very similar conditions and it's the same topography, the same decisions, the same similar basing concentrations. And I've written lots of pieces about how similar their actions will be to the decisions that Japanese took because they're shaped by topography and distance.
I know China makes 70% of the world's drones. I wanted to ask you a bit about weapons and drones. I mean, how concerned should we be about what China has?
Super concerned. So we are in a period, and you see this in history, as this entropy rises and as the friction between systems rise and they start to closely and begin to engage, the challenging system has a number of hallmarks. And one of them is it's very innovative. And so I remember warning people that China was copying and assimilating in the early 2000s, but it will shift from copy and assimilate to out-innovate. And then it will use its industrial base and its innovation status to literally strip us apart. And they have double the number of patents as Americans do, so they're out-innovating us. But they're particularly harnessing it to weapons. So one of the problems about war is it's like a cancer that metastasizes. And so, you imagine the Spanish Civil War, most people don't even remember it, fascists versus, the Nazi socialism and fascists versus communism. And what came out of it? The Condor Legions were sent by Germany to fight for Franco and the fascists, and they developed blitzkrieg. They first used their Junkers 87 with armor, and that was their blitzkrieg was tested. So these wars that we don't think affect core homelands of big powers are really dangerous because they gestate new technologies. So all the new technologies that have been developed on the front line, which are drone orientated, there are lots of other ones like EW, electronic warfare, and all sorts of other systems which are coming to light. Long-range air-to-air sniping, as we saw in Pakistan, where the J-10C basically knocked a Rafale out the sky with a Meteor missile because it sniped from a longer range, which they should have seen the signs from actually what's happening in Ukraine, because the Russians have been doing that to the Ukrainians with their longer range missiles. But the net effect is every single lesson that the Russians learn is learnt by the Chinese. Every lesson then goes into their manufacturing, their military planning, and because they're faster and more adaptable, it means they'll get those new systems faster than we will, because all war is about an adaptation cycle. So every time this continues, it's getting worse for us. And of course, if they use an ATACMS, one or two ATACMS don't go off and it's dismembered and off it goes to China, and it's replicated, is it better than, or can we improve it? So those edges start to disappear, which is why the technology we give Ukraine has to be balanced. We can't just give them the best of everything, but we should give them a lot more than we do.
Taking a step back from this, I wanted to look at how China has kind of got to where it is in terms of unethical or questionable industrial practices that is conducted on the West.
Again, I'm going to take us back a bit before I answer the now. Interesting enough, the Chinese argue they're the longest contiguous great empire in the world, and that's part of their moral supremacy. And intrigued by that, I happened to be in Rome like a year and a half ago, and Rome's fascinating because its architecture really talks to the empires which have occupied it and the history of Rome and the empires that it trod on, including the Romans and the Greeks. And that got me thinking that, in fact, if you draw a circle around the centre of civilization in ancient China, and draw the same circle which covers roughly in Egypt in Cairo, goes through Rome and includes Greece in the middle, it's roughly the same area.
Yeah.
So what we don't think about in the West is the Egyptians were the first big civilization, then the Greeks came along, and then the Romans, and in fact they're contiguous, but we think of them as separate. And when you do that, actually Western empires are 1,000 years older than Chinese empires. Which is interesting because it's a reconstruction of the information, and it certainly challenges this fundamental story that the Chinese are telling us now, that their contiguous empire and civilization gives them the right to rule. It's very subtle, but it's very there. So this current incarnation in China starts with the Boxer Revolution, and that was the beginning of the centuries of humiliation at the hands of the British Empire, the Opium Wars, humiliation, loss of direction. And it was the rising up and rejection of Western values by the Boxers, who were fundamentally Taoist, and they had a revolution, and the revolution was the beginning of new Chinese self-identity, which accumulated at the end of the Civil War between the nationalists and the communists. And I kind of laugh about that because they were both pretty hierarchical. Their systems weren't that much different in terms of the massive pyramid of how the people at the top control the people at the bottom. Right. The communists won. And here's the first sort of finger in the eye for people that say China's lovely and peaceful, is they went to war with everyone they could until 1975. For the next 26 years, every neighbour, everyone around them, ending in Vietnam, they went to war with. That's because they were expansive. And they stopped because they couldn't get any further. Because at that time, America was beginning to get control of the Cold War, and its influence contained them. Until finally in 96, in frustration, they were trying to go and reach across to Taiwan, and the Americans sent through 2 carriers and a MEU, and they realized they could not overtly challenge America. Its power was absolute. So they came up with a really cunning plan. It was a covert plan, and the plan A was to seduce the West, to invest in its industrial base, to give it an industrial base, so in inverted commas, you'll lower your inflation because we'll manufacture more cheaply. So every industrialist and everyone from Wall Street said, yeah, we'll do that. Money flowed in. At the same time, they built 200,000 of hackers that stripped IP from everything that moved, which should have been the first sign it wasn't going the way we thought it was going. They obviously built their industrial base more and more. They educated their people. They stripped the IP. The system grew. And then 2012, Xi came along. And by then they really had built a monster, and they knew they had a monster. It was still very covert, but he moved to a more overt identity for China's next expansion. And since then it's just got worse and worse. The West got weaker because it prints money. Its real productivity has decreased. It's been deindustrialized voluntarily, and it doesn't make the things it needs. It's super codependent and with China, which has inhibited many of its responses. Many of the important people who've been bought off, politicians have been, the number of politicians that have been seduced into turning the other way, I think would be huge. Less now because it's a hot topic, but in the past I think we've had a lot. And in this country we've had a blindness to China that was just incredible. Driven by the Treasury's need to make money from someone and have investment, we tried to give our soul away, and the Treasury has had some orthodoxies like higher taxes mean higher revenues. Nope. Had orthodoxies like more immigrants, more revenue. Nope. And another orthodoxy is make friends with the Chinese and get lots of Chinese investment, but in the end you end up being owned by them. So The Treasury has a lot to answer for, I think. It's been an architecture of policy, despite whichever party gets in. And when Reform gets in, they're going to have to break that orthodoxy before they go anywhere. As Liz Truss tried to do and paid the price for, they're going to have to be smarter than Liz Truss if they're going to get through it. But going back to your China question, China is now in a condition where after the pandemic released, and one of the things that I argue that it may not have been an accidental release from a laboratory, because its real purpose was to accelerate the debt burden of the West by creating the image that essentially if you were disciplined like the Chinese and you locked down and stuffed your economy, that essentially, it would go away and you'd defeat the disease. But what that meant was then you were reliant on debt, and then you'd over-debt, burden yourselves, and you couldn't use that debt for an arms race. The 200 billion that we used in the whole pandemic could have been used to transform our defences, transform them. But we didn't, and it's one of the reasons why even America couldn't afford to match the arms race of China. So since then, China went into this situation where it stopped really being a manufacturing export economy, and it moved itself into a sort of manufacturing internally fueled consumer society with a demand gap, and a society that's militarized itself in ways that will blow people away when they study it. And there's huge amounts of evidence on my site if you subscribe to it. And when you read it, you will realize how real this process is. And it reminds me of, we're not dealing with Germany, Nazi Germany, as dynamic as it was, that came to power in 1933 and went to war 6 years later. We're dealing with a country of organization and vision that's been planning this for 30 years. That is frightening because we don't plan anything for 30 years. And it involves infiltration of our societies, infiltration of our technology. It's just a frightening picture that we face when the time comes. And I think we're going to find ourselves on the back foot for, as we did in 1914, 3 years. If we did in 1939, it was 4 years before we made any forward progress. We'll be lucky if it's 4 years, and it's going to be a very traumatic period when the blow lands, unless we do something about it.
When you understand China in the way that you do, it can be quite frustrating when you see the politicians, business leaders. Why do you think their understanding is not where it is? Is it that they know this stuff and want to ignore it, or is it that they truly don't know?
So I think all of us have a human glitch, and that is we project ourselves onto others. And it's only a unique set of humans that actually try and get in the head of someone else to understand what the other side sees and thinks. And it's particularly disastrous when you meet human predators, because human predators use your projection as their camouflage, do their damage to you, and you only find out until it's too late that you just lost your kneecaps. And in a strange way, that metaphor that happens between individuals has been happening between states, because Putin and Xi are human predators, and they've used their camouflage to survive interactions with foreign diplomats who think they're really smart, but in fact aren't because they're not self-aware, that are busy projecting what they think they want as Chinese onto them, which Xi understands and uses until the last moment. So it's a manipulation that happens on a personal level on a national scale. And then on top of that, we've had greater linearity of our leadership. And, linear people tend to accept the paradigms they're framed in, whereas lateral people challenge the frames and ask the right questions. So that's made us more vulnerable and susceptible to this form of predation.
So if you had the Prime Minister's ear, what are the key things that need to happen to deal with this?
Well, I mean, there are, in some ways, there's no simple solution, but let's just go, what do you immediately need to do? You need to defend your nation. And to defend your nation, you need to admit you're at war already. And that war isn't somewhere in the distance, and that war isn't just the Russians. Because one of the things that has become a dogma in the MOD and our governments is, well, we've got 4 or 5 years before the Russians reconstitute themselves and become a threat to us. Well, that's not the threat. The threat is when basically the Chinese go to war in the Asian basin, and like the Pacific War before, it's not very man-intensive, it's ship and technology-intensive, which leaves them with millions and millions of men that migrate to the Eastern Front and fight alongside the Russians. And they come very quickly. So what we face is the Chinese joining the Russians in much shorter order. Once you start to think about that as a threat, you are galvanized. You're galvanized to think, how do I defend my country? And the first thing we've learned is you have to have a missile defense. So absolute national priority is to defend the homeland. And the parallel was essentially with the bomber fleets of the Third Reich, building and building. It wasn't actually the Air Ministry that said we need to have an air defence system, because they were still invested in the bomber always gets through and we'll just build a bigger bomber force and that'll deter their bomber force. But actually the public said defend us. So Fighter Command came into being under Dowding, and he was a man of vision. He created an air defence system which allowed us to survive the Battle of Britain. We need that right now. We need a man with Dowding's vision that's given an imperative to build it, to make sure we integrate capabilities like we buy SAMTs from the Italians and the French. We make sure that our, in effect, our Aster 30 missiles, which sit inside the silos of our Type 45s, are upgraded to NT standard, capable of like ballistic missile defence. We spend $20 billion, pounds if we have to, right now, to defend our island. Because if we can't defend it, we're finished. So that's our absolute priority. Our next priority is essentially our responsibility in NATO is the Northern Atlantic, and it's our flank. It's where we can be attacked by submarines, launch missiles, and they can be prevented from our logistical freight working between NATO and America. And so we need to build our navy, and we need to take the ships we do have that are stuck in port and get them out of port. We need to develop new serviceability process where most modern navies are lucky to get 30% serviceability of their fleet. The Australians have created some very innovative techniques, which I know some teams which put into place, and we have to do them so we get up to 46% availability. And then we start sticking weapon systems on the ships we have, like all over the place, so now they're really lethal. And then you start looking at how you build new ships. So we need to do that. And we need to make sure that our air power works, and that basically we do have the combat patrols that mean that nothing gets into our airspace. And then we need proper drone interdiction, low technology drone interceptors, of the type which are now being talked about, whether they're drone on drones, whether they're just cheaper missile systems. We need like a super-layered air defense system. So that's number one. And that also links to the Navy, because the forward deployment of ships like the Type 45s and even the Type 23s have C-Septors, which are now area defense systems. So the Navy and Homeland Defense have never been more entwined in that respect. So that's our first priority. Our next priority is essentially to take ourselves from financialization, where we've been printing money and we've been part of the American money printing system by implication, and do what the Japanese have done, which was deleverage and learn how to produce real things. And in that respect, I think the Japanese are one of the greatest partners we can have, because they've been deleveraged and producing real things for a long time. So, for example, if we want to build ships, build partnerships with Japanese shipyards and South Korean shipyards, bring them to this country and take them against Babcock and BA Systems and start to bring the price down by efficiencies. So we need to think competitively and change the dynamics of how we acquire our weapons, especially the SMEs. And there's an enterprise which I'm involved with, which is basically how to fund SMEs with weapon systems that create lethality quickly to redress the balance, because our whole procurement system isn't working. Which leads us back to the MOD, which is a peacetime governmental structure totally unsuited to war. The majority of people in it are civilians on civilian agendas. They have no military background. They don't work to the same ways and codes as the military do. And they certainly don't understand that the weapon they might be ordering, they could be fighting, and does it work or not? So we need to actually militarize the MOD and make it fit and lateral and adaptive for war. And all of that requires a Prime Minister who recognises the prime danger. And if the Prime Minister is very smart by doing this, you can solve a lot of problems. You can solve the industrial problem, because now you're actually reindustrialising. And you have buyers all across NATO for your product if you get there first, so you make money from it. You employ people. You give people a common goal and a common enemy, who's a real enemy, and they stop fighting amongst themselves. And you create a much more productive society as a result. So that does require one thing, and that is courage. Courage to actually face what is coming towards us.
Yeah.
And then have the articulation to explain how you got it wrong for so long and how you lived in denial for so long. And denial was something we saw in 1914, right up until the first shot. There's a great bit where the bond markets of the UK gilt market went like this, and the first shot was fired and they dropped 50%, just like that. How could they not work out during the month things were going wrong? And collective denial is very strong at the end of a Pax Britannia, Pax America period, when everything changes. It's made worse by collective linearity, and it's made worse by high stock markets, which create lots of dopamine and no cortisol responses. So we've got three things compounding our what I call extinction dissonance. And that's where a leader needs to explain what's happening. We've been involved in a sub-threshold World War III process, which will escalate, as we're seeing, because Putin doesn't have anywhere to go but escalation. He's not going to give up, and he's not winning. So he will escalate. So that's inevitable. And you need the courage to talk to people about it, because people are scared. They really are scared, and they're scared to confront it. But they'll actually feel better if they confront it and we do something about it, rather than leave it in the subterranean boundaries of denial.
You mentioned this term to me before we came on air. I thought it was a fascinating term, Western denial. Can you just talk us a bit more about that?
Well, the Western denial comes through this multiplicity. I mean, one of the problems for the collective Western system, and America is the last of the Western Christian empires, with Britain trying desperately through Brexit to be a rebirthed moment. If you think of that 500-year period, the power, if you're American, you think you were powerful. But actually, if you really study Victorian power and gunboat power for 100 years after Trafalgar, Britain was unbelievably dominant in the world. Nothing moved unless we said so. Way more than America ever did, which was really part of a Cold War bipolar system. And he broke out into a unipolar system after the 1990s. So their feel or an appreciation of their degree of power versus the power in the previous empire, they don't realise actually it's less than as part of that declining process. I think also Americans don't understand the continuum that started with the Portuguese, the Dutch and the Spanish, the French, and then the British, and then Germany tried twice, and then the Americans. They can't see that continuum. But what we're really talking about is the system of way of life, the Western Christian value system, with infused with democracy, is coming to an end. And we're in that end process where we need to reinvent ourselves. And that brings with it hubris. And hubris brings deniability. Like, I love battleships, and carriers won't threaten battleships because our armour's too much. But they worked in the last war, they'll work in the next war. So we've got an awful lot of those mindsets. And they feed this denial. And this denial is also fed because, as it was in 1914, how could we ever go to war? We've had peace for 100 years. How could we go to war because the Germans were our main ally on the continent? We fought with them in various wars. And how could we do that? And actually, I don't really want to look in the mirror and see it. And then you couple it with this idea that our leaders are collectively linear and refuse to look outside the railway tracks. There are no sheepdog barking and saying, everyone, we're in trouble. And then on top of that, you've got this cortisol suppression with the dopamine of the product of printed money in our markets, which makes it all look like it's really okay. But it isn't okay, because we know the poverty levels are rising. There's a few people with huge assets who are just getting richer and richer, and people actually living have become poorer and poorer as the poverty line has moved up through Britain and American society. And the real arbiter of an empire's expansion and its success after its military expansion is how that line of wealth moves down and down through society. And so the poverty line is pushed down by an empire's success. Yeah. And we have been going through exactly the opposite. And to compound that, we are going to have increasing inflation. We've had very suppressed inflation. So going back to the cycle that we should be in, it would be like 75 was an inflation peak in this Kondratyov cycle. We're in the 70s, maybe 71. Inflation's at 10% before it really peaks up at 15% CPI for the US. 10-year rates of 15% and Fed funds at 23%, and much worse in Britain. Now, the reason why we are sort of knocked out of kilter is, I believe, because China was brought into the global fold and its industrial effectiveness lowered inflation for a period. And so it's been suppressed with the money printing dynamic, and the numbers are manipulated. I'm afraid they're not the same numbers as they were. So in fact, our real inflation is much, much higher than the numbers suggest. And when the shoot happens, which is probably the conflict spike, that's when we see inflation through resource constriction. So higher rates, higher long-term rates, bond crisis, inflation, they're all part of this picture. And my biggest fear is that America stands at the same debt to GDP ratio as it did at the end of World War II. It had just won a war, funded a war, had become an empire, and that's where its debt to GDP ratios. It hasn't even rebuilt its military so it's effective. The war hasn't started, and it's starting at that point. And it worries me that Britain started in 1914 at a much higher relative point on its empire curve, was much healthier, and it was bust by 1917 and needed America, and the transfer of wealth from one empire to another started. In the Second World War, we were gone by 1940. We needed American money in 41. So, we got weaker and weaker as these conflict dynamics happened, and we gave our assets away when we couldn't produce any more gold. And there is no reserve. Where is the reserve for America? Who backs America? Has America backed Britain? So there are some big concerns about sustainability of conflict. And my conclusion is, just like Ukraine has had to fight on constricted ways and find cheaper ways to fight, we're going to end up fighting a war that has exquisite weapons and mass cheap weapons of effect that literally we do what we can with the money we have. So it'll be a very different construct. Rather than an exquisite war, it'll be a high-low mix type conflict and an armaments process.
Also, just wanted to ask you about Chinese influence in Britain. We see kind of like utilities, energy companies, and they're owned by the Chinese. We see universities, and there's Chinese control over them, and they're funding a lot of that. Can you talk a bit about that?
I think the phrase is we need to get the Reds out of our bed. And it really goes back to, I think, Cameron and Osborne, who even then we could see what China was. But no, they were determined to make a golden era and bend over backwards and allow money to come in anywhere despite the strategic leverage it gave the Chinese. I mean, to be involved in our nuclear power program, horrendous. To be involved in our telecommunications network, oh my God, whoever thought that was okay? With Huawei. And everywhere they go for a reason, because they extract something for it, whether it's subsequent control, subsequent sabotage at a key point, or in the case of universities, a ripping of our IP before it's even nascent form, and then the training of their scientists who then go back and make systems and weapons that then come back and club us over the head. The short-sightedness of it is unbelievable. And I think, again, it comes down to liberal naivety, this predator dynamic where people are so unconscious they project themselves onto the predator who uses that projection as camouflage, and greed, because they've had money when we haven't, and we've been, sticking our kowtowing for money. And that is one of the worst forms of the betrayal of your nation, because you are betraying your nation by accepting that money if you understand what that money is going to do. And I've been talking about investors in China and how they are literally destroying and mortgaging their children's future when they do it. And I remember going to a big trade event in London of like 120 people, and the Chinese trade envoy was there. And there was obviously people from England. And I just stood up and I said to all of you here, do you really realise what this is all about? And how dangerous these people are. And everyone said, they all agreed, but how did you have the courage to say it? And would you make it home in one piece?
Yeah.
But not a single person came up and said, a lot of people said, I'm glad you said that, because I wouldn't have the courage to say it. But most people just carried on, because if they can make it work with a Chinese company and they get paid, they'll do it. And we've been really greedy and short-sighted to allow that to happen. And people like some of the in the conservative right have been really spot on about the security threats of China. And I really applaud, it's one part of the Conservatives consistently, I applaud, they've been ringing the bell more than anyone else, and continue to, even though their voice is muffled.
What can ordinary folk do? I know you have this as a bit of a campaign on your website, if they're worried about the hegemony of China.
So the first thing I would say is democracy is a wonderful thing, and we all have a voice. And you can easily say, well, I don't have a voice. You do have a voice, because you can articulate, talk to your friends, they'll talk to their friends, and it'll cascade through the system. So the first thing is to have the courage to see what's really happening to us. And my website is all about that. I decided to create a public vehicle for what I'd worked out in the investment world and took it out of investment so everyone could see what was happening to us and become informed. And that isn't easy. And I would say for 10% of the population, they'll read my work and say, you've articulated what I felt and I couldn't put my finger on it, and give me more information than I could have hoped for. For another 90% who live in denial, it is a difficult place to go to. So only a few of you of the 90% are going to have the courage to do that as the urgency comes towards you. But you are going to do that because we have to do it. And by becoming informed, by understanding what's really happening to us, not the version which is, it was quite interesting because yes, we have some conspiracies. But many of the things that I see in society are just a product of this linearization, this blindness towards information, this idea that, we all watch The Matrix, take the blue pill. Take the blue pill is my advice. By taking the blue pill, what does it do? You become informed. You understand the risks that we face. You respect our ancestors who fought for our freedoms by actually expressing the desire and questioning nature to find out what is true and not true. You then get to talk about it with your friends, and if you're concerned, you let them concerned, and if you are concerned, you write to your MP. You create a cascade of knowledge, and it's quite incredible how those cascades can change things. And it always starts with each of us. So I think we have a patriotic obligation to do this. And I have tried to encourage people over the years to, view this as, it isn't just about money. It isn't just about views. It's actually about our future, because we face an almost uncertain future. In fact, I'll go further. We will not survive the Chinese. I can see if we carry on like this, the Chinese will dominate the globe, and freedom of speech and democracy and the genes of lateralization that created the origins of democracy will all be removed from mankind's genes. And for English people who are pretty individualistic, that means an awful lot of us will be on the disappear list. So there's a lot at stake here. And if I sound alarmist, you just have to go to the website and look at the evidence. It's overwhelming of the actions the Chinese are taking to move towards a point of conflict.
David Murrin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lee. It's been a great pleasure.